The world is changing. Inspiration is everywhere. It has never been so easy to connect, share, and bring people together. We're learning from others and finding the best in ourselves. Challenging our beliefs. Sharing our vulnerability. Overcoming our fears. Transforming ourselves so we can transform the world. How far can we go?
This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is... This is London Real. I am Brian Rose. My guest today is Dr. David Martin, the American author, professor, and researcher. You are the founder and CEO of MCAM, which provides research and advice to over 160 countries regarding finance, patents, and trades. You were the central figure in the documentary film Plandemic 2, which we live streamed here on our Digital Freedom platform to over 2 million viewers, the largest live broadcast of a documentary film in history. In the movie, you exposed the elaborate web of deception and lies by governments, corporations, and regulators that caused the COVID-19 pandemic. And you also appear in the latest installment, Plandemic 3, The Great Awakening. Ultimately, you believe COVID was a pre-planned act of biological and chemical warfare perpetrated on the human race. And you said exactly that in the European Parliament during the recent International COVID Summit in Brussels. David, welcome back to London Real.
I am so happy to see you, Brian. It's great to be here. And man, what a beautiful suit you've got on.
Well,
some great things never change.
Well, that's a beautiful tie. And the man that consistently pulls off the bow tie is a strong man indeed. We'll definitely get you over to London and we'll go down to Savile Row and maybe you can teach me a thing or two. How's that?
There you go.
David, I couldn't be more excited to speak to you. I just uploaded a 20-minute piece of you speaking in front of the EU, and I highly recommend everybody go watch that when we're finished. I think it's probably the single most important, most prescient, most potent description of the entire pandemic. And you break down everything that you've been talking about for 20 plus years, and you take us all the way back to 1965 when this whole thing started. And I had a couple flashbacks back to Plandemic 2, but you didn't go all the way into it in Plandemic 2 because it was probably so much information and it was early days. But what you said recently in front of the EU, along with the emotional content, for me, it's the most powerful thing I've seen in years. And I was curious, how would you describe, what you said? Because I think the average person watching us right now has no idea of the detail that you can break down as far as the traces of what happened to us the last few years.
Brian, a lot of people have asked how I do research. And in the case of not only the coronavirus situation, but in the case of anthrax and in the case of conotoxin, in the case of an enormous number of other things, including the Ebola campaign during the mid-2000 teens, the difference between what a lot of people do and what I do is I watch the thing as it unfolds. You made reference in the opening to the fact that we advise 168 countries. What I receive inside of our corporate structure is the innovation disclosures, contracts, records of procurement, all kinds of things. And that goes into the Cuisinart of our data. It's how we make our global equity indexes that are traded. It's how we do our business. And so we don't look for things. We actually have a system that flags things. I can set flags for all sorts of things. I can set flags for violations of laws. I can set flags for all sorts of either themes or content or actors or whatever. And in the early 2000s, and a lot of people don't know this, but in the early 2000s, when we were asked to look into the anthrax outbreak, which most people don't even remember. I mean, when we talk about September 2001, everybody thinks about planes and towers. But the global fear in September of 2001, and the thing that was exploited to pass what ultimately became the PrEP Act in 2005, was the anthrax outbreak that allegedly happened at the end of the month. And because of the cognitive dissonance of did planes really fly into towers, people forget that the real terrorist attack was actually anthrax. And the problem about forgetting that is people also forget that several years after the alleged investigation, we were able to definitively and unequivocally and without censorship say the United States Department of Defense attacked America. There you go. It's not hard. And the problem, right, is by the time that statement was made, kind of like UFOs are real, gender isn't real, all of the crazy other things that people say, the problem is by the time you get to the conversation where people admit, oh my gosh, the US really did anthrax to itself, people have forgotten the story. And so in many respects, COVID is amnesia 2.0. That's how we should describe it, because this was another US did it to itself, right? And the Wall Street Journal just this past week, and this part cracked me up, through this amazing FOIA request, which allegedly was something they fought long and hard for. You know what they found? What you and I talked about nearly 3 years ago. But if you're looking for the whodunit as a forensic investigator versus you're observing the crime as it unfolds, you have two very different perspectives. And what I really did at the EU Parliament is said, hey, slow the tape down. Let's get all the facts on the table. Coronavirus, COVID-19, the whole thing was premeditated. It was murder. It was active terrorism by a state against the world. Let's call it what it is. And let's not pretend like maybe there's a more complex explanation for, I don't know, the facts. And the facts are, here's the bad news, for 58 years, the United States, the UK, in collaboration with researchers around the world, planned to use coronavirus to instill the most tyrannical reform of society that this generation has ever seen. And they did it purely premeditated to make sure that we were cowed into submission. And the bad news for them is there's a lot of people that didn't take the knee.
It's just incredible when you start going through the dates, and maybe just take us back to some of these dates, 1965, 1967, 1990, where these events, and when you do it, it's like watching a train wreck in slow motion. And again, the beautiful thing about your work in Plandemic 2 is that there was no emotion, there was no opinion, it was all facts. It was published documents where you can literally show, and as you walk us right up to 02 and right us up to 2020, you literally have specific mentions about exactly what's going to happen. Yeah. That document what you just said, because a lot of people will hear what you just said and be like, okay, here's another one who's making these claims, but you can document every single thing you're saying.
Well, and not only can I, in the EU Parliament speech, I actually put every single reference in. There's not a single thing I said that's not referenced with the source document behind it. So you can read it, do it yourself. Go read it, read the document, and draw a different conclusion. But let's go back to 1965 because it's important to do this. And remember that 1965 is only a few years, less than 2 decades, from when we even had the idea of what DNA and RNA even were. Remember, it's 1953 that we figure out DNA. So, when I talk about 1965, we're talking about a 12-year-old technology that we don't even understand, where researchers in the United States started guessing that this thing that they decided to call coronavirus was interesting because they actually saw it associated with people that had various kinds of colds and influenza-like illness and so forth. And they also found out that you could play around with it and get it to change its targets really quickly, which is a really interesting kind of, is that a good thing to know? Is it a bad thing to know? It sounds like gain of function research. But But what happened between 1965 and 1967 was a violation of, at that time in the UK, Nuremberg standards, and in the United States, a violation of our biological and chemical weapons laws dictated in Section 18 of the U.S. Code. What specifically we did was we took what was allegedly pathogen samples from the United States, and in 1967 and in 1968, we infected Britons who were healthy. Just let that chill just for a minute, like a rosé on a hot summer afternoon, right? That's a, oh my God, what did you just say? I said it. We broke the law. We knew that we had something that made people sick. We shipped it from the United States to the United Kingdom, and the United Kingdom infected British citizens with a U.S. pathogen, allegedly to see if we could do it. Now, by the way, in 1967 and 1968, nobody in Great Britain was sitting there going, I wonder if we've got a treatment for it. They were first trying to see if they could infect people with the thing, right? That's kind of an important point to make, because the waiver of biological and chemical weapons laws in the United States and the waiver of the Nuremberg standards in the UK are based on whether you're doing research for the purpose of benefiting therapies, not seeing if you can infect people. And this is one of those little nuances that if anybody bothered to read the law, they'd go, oh my God, what he's saying is actually true. We can research for the purpose of treatment, but we cannot research for the purpose of going, what if we can take a biologic sample from the United States and make people in the UK sick? And that's 1967, 1968. That's not kind of, a couple weeks before COVID. That's before most of us were born. Not me, not you, but most of the people who are watching. This is before you. And what's important about that is if you go back and you look at the research, and this was primarily the United States and the UK, primarily throughout the 70s, going into the early 80s, what they found was that this crazy thing that they had labeled coronavirus was engineerable to all sorts of specifications. You could make people sick. You could target different tissue. It was kind of a Darwin's grab bag of what you could do with the thing. And then in the 1980s, farmers, and specifically farmers of pigs and breeders of dogs, started realizing that this coronavirus thing that they were talking about was associated with gastroenteritis in little baby pigs and little baby dogs. And so there was a move in the 80s to see if there was a way to come up with a vaccine. And in 1990, a company that none of us have ever heard of, might start with a P, might be followed by another consonant, but a company that allegedly was, a master of no expertise at all in coronavirus, decided to patent a vaccine. And what's important about the vaccine that Pfizer patented in 1990 was it was RNA for the spike protein. So when I hear somebody come along and tell me that they had Operation Warp Speed, this rapid discovery of the way we're going to inject people in 2020, I sit back and go, Warp Speed. That only took 30 years of failed trial after failed trial after failed trial, which included as recently as 2018, a series of publications that said coronavirus and the vaccine concept cannot coexist. And they cannot coexist because the coronavirus model had been so manipulated, so contorted, so subject to gain-of-function research that you could never get a vaccine to immunize a population against infection with this thing. It would have never been possible. And by the way, for everybody who does the follow the science mantra, the science unambiguously says in thousands of publications, proceedings, and patents Vaccines do not work on coronavirus. That is the science. And by the way, nothing about COVID-19 has changed the science, because we now know that every injection that was ever given to anybody failed to stop infection or transmission at all. So my little observation about the 30-year scientific history is unfortunately backed up by the fact that even this go round, we haven't been able to immunize the population against anything. And so, Brian, the point of all of this legacy is that it was 30 years and it was Pfizer. It wasn't another company. It wasn't GlaxoSmithKline. It wasn't Sanofi Aventis. It wasn't those. It was Pfizer who had a mandate from what became World Health Organization, Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, Gavi, the NIAID, all of the DARPA funding. Pfizer was the lead horse in the race because they, in fact, owned the race. So is it a surprise that Pfizer is allegedly a dark horse in 2020 that comes out with this instantaneous ability to respond to something that they had 30 years of failed trials to produce and never once succeeded? You know, these are things where, unfortunately, the evidence is self-evident.
It's just mind-blowing, these facts. But it gets even better with your narrative. Walk me through, say, another 10 years, especially as we get up to 2002, and some of the stuff going on in Chapel Hill, because this story gets even more interesting. It's kind of like the Bible. It gets even more interesting.
Yeah, well, so 1990, we find out that dogs and pigs still get sick. And in fact, when you inject them with the Pfizer vaccine, they die. So there's that problem. And it's really unfortunate, by the way, if a side effect of a thing that's supposed to make you healthy is death, it does feel a little awkward to try to pitch it as a solution. And not surprisingly, Anthony Fauci, because by this time, you'll recall, in the 1980s, he got the National Vaccine Injury, the National Childhood Vaccine Injury Act passed 1986 with President Reagan. And if we go back and look at what his dream was, in fact, he stated it, he misspoke on camera. He said invariably within his career, he meant inevitably, but invariably within his career, he was going to produce a universal vaccine. He was going to try to use HIV scare back in the 1980s to be the animating impulse to get the public to fall for a universal vaccine. And he thought, and researchers at the University of North Carolina, Chapel Hill verified, that you could take the coronavirus model and use it as a vaccine vector. Now, let me unpack what that means, because a lot of people don't know what that term means. Because of the nature of the product that we call the coronavirus, and I'm not going to get into is there or isn't there. What I'm saying is the object identified as coronavirus has a series of proteins on the outside of it which actually connect with the cell. And that instructs the cell to allow the contents of that thing to actually get into the cell. Now, what makes that particularly interesting is that because it can be so precisely engineered, if you were going to deliver another agent, whether that other agent was a vaccine, whether that other agent was a therapeutic, if you were going to deliver another agent using this particle, the coronavirus model, as a way to deliver a thing was actually a plausible idea. So plausible that Anthony Fauci in the early 1990s figured out that he was going to use the coronavirus model as a vaccine for HIV. So in other words, you're going to take the coronavirus, put HIV in it, and that was going to be the vaccine. So that's a pretty dark thing I just said. I said it in a fairly light way, but it's a pretty terrifying thing when you hear what I just said. He was going to use coronavirus as the delivery agent for HIV. But there was a tiny problem. GlaxoSmithKline and others had this drug called AZT, which was being used to allegedly treat and really kill AIDS patients. And AZT had 7 years of patent life left on it. So what Anthony Fauci did was he actually decided to let the whole HIV vaccine thing go on ice for a little while the 7-year remaining patent life of AZT and the extortionary pricing that came with that patent came at the expense of the lives of AIDS patients. And what they did was from the late 1980s, technically, up until nearly 2000, right, 1999, they allowed AZT to run out its patent, extorting healthcare across the world, billions of dollars to kill AIDS patients. And then they decided to pick up the injection program at UNC Chapel Hill in 1999. And they funded a guy named Ralph Barrett and his collaborators at UNC Chapel Hill. And between 1999 and 2002, they developed what they called an infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus. Now, if you listen to what I said about the vaccine vector, now it makes sense, right? Why do you want an infectious replication defective? Well, infectious means you want the thing to make the cell sick, and you want to introduce it, but you don't want it to then propagate like the other viral models do, which says that once inside your cell, you make more of them, and then they go out and they infect other people. So this idea was to build a bullet that carried a bullet inside of it. Think about it as a bunker busting round in the military. You have a pre-charge that blasts the thing open, and then you have a secondary charge that does the lethal work, right? Same thing, just on a very small scale. So this was a bunker buster. Coronavirus was going to be the bullet that pierced the cell wall to drop the other toxin in. And in 2002, the University of North Carolina Chapel Hill patented the infectious replication defective clone of coronavirus and succeeded in making it target heart and lung tissue. Now, just let that chill for a moment again, right? Remember, we're talking about researchers that said, it's making dogs and pigs sick. Let's see if we can take that same thing and see if we can target the heart. Let's see if we can target the lungs. And if you had an outstanding question in your mind, like, are these good people just misguided? Listen to this sentence one more time. Target the heart. Target the lungs. Does that sound like the place where you'd set an immunologic target? Does it sound like you'd want to go ahead and make sure that vascular tissue and respiratory tissue are your primary target? I don't know about you, Brian, but the beating of my heart and the breathing of my lungs is something that I kind of want to leave pretty unmessed with. But that's not what they did. They actually targeted the heart and the lungs, and they filed the patent on it in 2002. And what makes that particularly important is we did not have SARS 1.0. Forget 2.0. We did not have the SARS outbreak in 2003 until we had already built the bullet and started shooting it. We never had SARS. There was no such thing as COVID-1 or COVID-2. We never had those things. We had a weapon that was dispensed in a population. That's what we had. And by 2003, when the world was allegedly going to fall into the throes of all the pharmaceutical companies that were going to come up with vaccines, which, by the way, 2003, this is important. And every fact checker has tried to disprove this. And unfortunately, the facts are as they have been stated. In April of 2003, the CDC filed a patent on what they called SARS coronavirus isolated from humans. It took them 4 years to get that patent issued. It took them bribing the patent office to get it issued after the patent examiners twice rejected it as an illegal patent. All of the things
To continue watching the rest of the episode for free, visit our website londonreal.tv or click the link in the description below.